Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to look at GraphQL, which is a query language for APIs. It also provides runtime to help you execute those queries given your data model. Now, in this video, we're going to look at how to implement a simple GraphQL API using Python. And the library we're going to be using in this case is going to be the Graphene Python library. So we can look at the documentation at graphenepython.org, and this is simply a library that helps us to execute a GraphQL API using a code-first approach. So normally you would want to write schemas and using GraphQL's data definition language. But in this case, we're going to use Python code to write our types and the other concepts involved. Now let's look at a simple GraphQL service that we're going to be implementing in this video. So when I go to my localhost 8000, we have a simple GraphQL service, nothing big, just one type, which is a type of a person. So given that type, we can execute queries in our given data model. So our person has the following fields. So we have a last name and an age. However, we even have a first name. We also have, let's say, an email. So when you send this, the query returns only the data that we need in this case. Now the beauty with GraphQL, it prevents things like underfetching and overfetching. Overfetching occurs in a moment where you have to actually query for data from an endpoint, and then it returns most of the data that is not even needed within the request. Now the beauty with GraphQL is you only return the data that you need. And the beauty with GraphQL is you only have one endpoint. You don't have various endpoints to which you make the request to. Now we're going to look at how we can implement this using only Python. We're not going to go into databases yet. I'm going to cover that in the next video. So let's get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to create the environment from which we're going to run our project. So I'm going to go to my terminal right here. I'm using Windows subsystem for Linux, so I'll stop the server that's running now. I'll go and create a new folder. So I'm just going to come and say mkdir, which is make directory. Then inside here, I'm going to simply create a simple folder. So this folder, let me call it GraphQL API. Now within my GraphQL API, I'm going to open up VS Code. I'm just going to cd into the GraphQL API folder. It's actually GraphQL API. And then within here, I'm just going to open up my VS Code. Now I'm also going to create our virtual environment here, and I'm going to use pipenv. So we're going to look into how to use pipenv as well. So I'm just going to come right here. So when I come here, I'm going to create our virtual environment with pipenv. So if you don't have pipenv, we'll install it with pip install pipenv. So I'm just going to come and say pipenv, and then I'll say shell. I'll actually have to first deactivate the virtual environment that we have currently. So after deactivating that virtual environment, I'm just going to simply come, and what I'll do is to create a new virtual environment within this folder. So I'll say pip env and then shell. So this will go ahead and create a virtual environment. So we actually have an unknown virtual environment already activated. So maybe I'll open up a new tab, I'll close that, then I'll open up a new. So I'll navigate to our folder. It's actually documents, and then coding, and then we shall go to the GraphQL API folder. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and create our virtual environment. So to do that, I'll just say pip env and then shell. So this is going to go ahead and create a simple virtual environment within our folder, and then we shall go ahead and actually install the required dependencies for our project given the virtual environment. Now that our virtual environment has been created, we can even notice that we have a pip file within our virtual environment. So the next thing I'm going to do is to install the required dependencies for our project. So I'll navigate to our virtual environment and then use pip env. So I'll say pip env, and then I'll go ahead and install Graphene. So we're going to use Graphene. So I'm going to install Graphene in this case. And this is going to go ahead and install Graphene within our virtual environment. So when you go back to our folder right here, we have our pip file, which is simply a file that's going to contain our dev dependencies or our dev packages. So after installing Graphene, then we shall go ahead and also define the data model that we're going to actually use in this project. Alright, so now that our Graphene has been installed, I'm going to go ahead and create our data model. So think of our data model as the way you may have your data stored in your database. So in this case, you define your data model and then you'll be able to expose it via a GraphQL service, as we're going to see. So the first thing we're going to do is to define our data model. So I'm going to head over to our file here, so we even see our pipfile.doc has been created. So I'm just going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this file model.py. Let me just call it models.py. So since we're not going to use our database, we're going to go ahead and use our Python data structure. And in this case, I'm going to use a dictionary. So I'm going to use the named tuple from collections to create the person type. So let's look at how we're going to do this. So I'm going to say from collections, we are going to import named tuple. And then I'm going to go ahead and create our person type. So I'm going to come right here and I'll say person is going to be equal to a named tuple. So a named tuple creates a type, and this type also has its attributes, just like you can create a class and the various attributes attached to that class. So I'm going to call this type the person type, and then we're going to create a list of the various fields on that class or that type. So in this case, I'm going to give in our email, and then it's also going to have a first name. It's actually going to be a string, so let me actually close this. So it's going to have a first name, and then we are going to have the last name, and then right here we can even have our age. So using this name tuple, we can be able to create various instances of our person type using these various fields we've defined. So I'm going to go ahead and create our dictionary that's going to act as our dummy database, just an inbuilt Python data structure. So I'm just going to come right here and I'll say data, and this is going to be a dictionary. So right here I'm just going to give in a key, which is 1. So I'll create a person. Now I'll give this person an email. Let's say johndoe@gmail.com, and then I'll give him the first name. So let the first name be John, and then actually it's going to be John, and then John. Then shall give in the last name as Doe. So we will even provide the age. Let's say it's 23. So I'm going to create other people, so I'll just copy and paste. So when I copy this, I'm just going to simply come here and paste. So right after doing this, then I'm going to go ahead and substitute this for other people. So I'm going to create a person with key of 2. Now let's say this person is called, I'm just going to call them Jerry Blue, and then I'll just come right here and also provide the first name as Jerry Blue. So I'm just going to come here, I provide the age of 24. So I'll give in the key of 3. So let's actually say that this is going to be Jason Ross, and then we can provide the name as Jason, and then we can provide this as Ross. So let's say the age is 25 in this case. So I can even provide the other person. So the person is going to be, let's say the other person is going to be, in this case, let's say Bruce Wayne. So let's say we're going to provide Bruce Wayne, and then right here I'm going to come and say that we're going to have Bruce, and then we're going to have Wayne. So in this, I'm going to actually say let the age be 28. So right now we've created our data model, and then we're going to go ahead and use Graphene to create a type for this that we shall use to basically describe the various types as we're going to expose them by our queries. So the next thing I'm going to do is to create a schema that's basically going to define our data model using GraphQL types. So I'm just going to come right here. I'm going to create a file which I'm going to call schema.py. And then within schema.py, I'm going to create our types. So types in GraphQL basically define data as given by our data model on the backend, be it in our database or our database models as we're using an ORM. So I'm just going to come and import the object type class. So the object type class is the root class from which you create all types. So I'm just going to import it from Graphene. So I'll say from Graphene, I'm going to go ahead and import the object type class. So right after importing the object type class, we are going to go ahead and create a class defining our data model we've created using our person. So I'm just going to come right here. I'll create a class. I'm going to just create a simple class. So I'm going to call this class our person class. Actually, let me call it the person type class. And then it's going to inherit from object type. So within an object type class, we go ahead and define the various fields as well as the different data types that those fields have. So we're going to basically make use of the fields we've defined here. So the first field is going to be our email. Actually, I like to mostly model this using an docstring. So I'll just come right here. I'll model this up. So the first thing is going to be defining our class as our person type. So this is going to be our person type. So our person type is going to have an email, and this email is going to be a string. So we're also going to have our first name. So we're going to have a first name. So this first name is also going to be a string. We're also going to have our last name, and this last name is also going to be a string. So we're also going to have an age, and this age is going to be an integer. So using this, it can somehow guide us into implementing our person type. So I just come right here, and then the first thing I'm going to do is specify our email. Now this email is going to be a string type. So I'm actually going to import string from GraphQL, from Graphene Just going to come right here. Just say this is going to be a string. So I'm just going to come at the top right here. I'll put in some parentheses here so that we can have this on multiple lines. And then I'm just going to come at a comma and then import our string. So right after importing our string, then we're also going to go ahead and define the field of first name. So we're going to have our first name, and this is also going to be a string. So also going to have our last name, and this is going to be a string as well. So we shall have our age, and our age is going to be an int. So I'm going to import our integer type. So I'll just come right here and say that we're going to have an integer. Oh, actually, it's going to be an int. So right after doing this, I'm going to save, and when I save, then we're going to basically define resolvers. So resolvers are just functions that allow us to basically show us the way we're going to use this when we query for our fields. For example, let's say I want to get only the email in our GraphQL query. So the way we do that is to create a resolver for the email. So we're going to say resolve and then email. So we make sure I rewrite resolve and then the name of the field we want to actually return. So in this case, it takes in the GraphQL context, it takes in the object or the. So in this case, I've actually used type person, which is basically standing for any instance of the person type. So in this case, I'm actually going to call this the person type. So, and then it's going to take in info about that specific instance. So the next thing I'm going to do is simply return the way we want this to be returned to us. So for example, I can just come and say return. In this case, we shall just return person dot. So we actually see the various attributes that kind of the person has or the instance of the person type has. So in this case, we're going to have person dot email. So the next thing I'm also going to resolve is going to be our first name. So I'll just come right here and say resolve, and then I'll say it's going to be our first name. So it's going to take in the GraphQL context, Graphene context, or which is person and info. So we shall actually return. I'm just going to copy this. So I'm I'm just going to actually copy paste the others. So I'll just come and say return. So in this case, we're going to return person.firstName. So it's actually going to be for the first name. So I'm just going to come and copy these resolvers for the rest of the fields, and then we're going to have them. So I'll just come and copy this, paste this. So this is actually going to be for our last name. So I'm just going to highlight what we need and then use Ctrl D. So this is going to be last name. So in here, I'm going to use RH. So I'll just come right here and then I'll say resolve, and then this will be age. So these are actually the resolvers that are just going to happen to help us to return the various fields that we shall query for them in our GraphQL API. Let me actually add a comment here. So these are going to be our resolvers. Now, after defining our resolvers, we are going to need a query class, a base query class that's basically going to define how we're going to return a specific type. So I'm just going to come and create that query class. So I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to be called the query class. So the query class is also an object type class, so I'll inherit from object type. And then it's going to have the fields, the various fields as we are going to return our type. So for example, if I wanted to return all people, I'll just come and create a field, which I'm going to call all people. And then this is going to be a field. So I'm going to actually create an instance of the field class from Graphene. So I just come at the top right here and then import our field. And then right after importing field, I'm going to come and add all people as a field in our base query class. So this is actually going to be our field. So the first thing it takes in is going to be the type, which defines the type, the GraphQL type in this case. So in this case, it's going to be of type, person, type. And then we're also going to need a resolver that's going to define how we're going to return all people. So I'm just going to come right here and then resolve. I'm going to resolve all people. So I'm just going to create a resolver for all people. So this is going to take in the root and then the info. So that's just going to take in the context of root and then the info. Then after doing this, we're going to define how we're going to return all people. So now we're going to use our data structure or our dictionary that we created right here. So I'm just going to come right here, and then what I'll do is to say return. So I'm just going to import our data. So I'll just come and say from models, we are going to import our data. So actually, let's see whether we are right. Yeah, we are right. So I'm going to import our data from models. It's actually from models import data. So just going to say from models, we're going to import our data, which is a dictionary. So right here, I'm just going to come and return our dictionary of all people. So I'll just come and say return data. And then in this case, let's just go ahead and return our data. So right after, actually, if we want to return our data, what we want is to return values, because then it's a dictionary. So I'll just come and say return data dot values. So since it's a dictionary, this is actually going to just give us access to all the values in our GraphQL service or our data. So let's go ahead and try to make a query. So to make a query, we need a schema that's basically going to take in this query and allow us to make queries based on this person type. So I'm just going to come right here. So I'm just going to call a variable called schema. So this is actually going to be an instance of the schema class from Graphene. So I'll just come right here and import our schema class. So after importing our schema class, I'm actually going to add a comma here. I'm just going to come and create this. So this takes in a query. So I'm just going to actually call this a query. And the query is going to actually be our base query class. So I'm just going to specify that here. And right after specifying that, I'm going to save. So now let's look into how we can be able to actually write queries for our API. So this is going to be our schema. So right after doing this, then I'm going to write a query string that's going to define which fields we're going to actually return out of our GraphQL query. So in this case, I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to specify. So I'll just write a query. I'm just going to come and say we're going to have a query string, and this query string is simply going to be a way that we're going to actually make queries on our API. So in this case, I'm just going to write two curly braces, and then I'll specify the type we're going to actually query for. And in this case, it's going to be all, actually, it's going to be the field of all people. So we're going to query for all people. Now keep in mind that we always use a camel case way. So for example, if you wrote something like if you wrote something in snake case like how you see here, all people, if we're making a query, we actually write all people. And then we specify the fields of all people that you want to actually return. Now in this case, let's say we want to return only the email. So let's say I'm going to return, sorry for this. So let's say we want to return only the email. So we want to actually execute this query using our schema that we've created here. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say that we're going to have our schema. So I'll just actually print this out. I'm just going to say schema dot execute, and then I'm just going to pass in our query string. So when I pass in our query string right here and save, I'm just going to head over to our terminal, and then we run this to see what it's actually going to return. So when I go to our terminal right here, I'm just going to come and run Python schema.py. So right now we have an error. So we have dict values has no object attribute email. So let's actually see what is happening right here. So when you go back right here, this is returning. So actually this is going to be a list of, it's actually supposed to be a list of values, which is something that we got wrong. So if you want to return all values, you want to actually use a list. And thanks to Graphene, it actually gives us a type for a list. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to actually say list. So I'm just going to come and add a comma right here. So instead of specifying this as a field, we're going to actually say that it's going to be a list of person type. So when I save this and head over to our terminal right here, when I run again, so this is actually going to return all people with their emails, just like you see here. Now let's say we also wanted to return the last name. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'll add a space and then say last. So keep in mind that we're actually using camel case to query for these fields. So if I want to query for the last name, I write last name and save. So when I go back right here and I try to run this, so now we see the last name and the email are being returned to us. Now the next thing we're going to look at is how we can be able to expose this to a front end. So just like we saw in the previous, we actually have our API exposed to a web interface, just like you can see here. So what we're going to do is to use FastAPI to expose our GraphQL API to our web front end, so as to make our work easier. So one thing I'm going to do is to install FastAPI first. I'm going to do that with pip env install, and then I'll say FastAPI. Now that FastAPI has been installed, we're going to go ahead and create a simple server. So we're actually going to write a simple FastAPI server that's going to allow us to expose this via our web front end. So to do that, I'm going to go back to our VS Code right here. So I'm going to create a new file. Just going to call this new file server.py. And then within server.py, I'm just going to go ahead and create a simple server. So to do that, I'll first import a FastAPI class. So I'll say from FastAPI, I'm just going to come and import FastAPI. I'll create a FastAPI instance. So I'm going to say API app is actually going to be FastAPI. Sorry for that. So this is going to be FastAPI. And right after doing that, let's first experiment with the REST endpoint. So I'll just come right here and say at app.route. So I'm just going to come and say it's actually going to be at app.get, since I'm just going to create a simple route that takes in a get method. So I'll just come and say this is going to be a sync and def. So when you write index, so this is actually going to be our root endpoint. So when you return In this case, we shall just return a simple message of yo. So when I save this, we're going to need UVCon to run our server. So I'll just come right here, and then I'll install UVCon. So I'll say ppnv install, and then UVCon. So this will install UVCon in our virtual environment. Now that UVCon has been installed, we're going to go ahead and actually run our app. So I'll just come right here and say UVCon. So UVCon works in a way that it takes in the module in which our app instance is in. So in this case, it's going to be our server module. So I'll write server, and then I'll specify the app instance or the FastAPI instance, which is actually going to be our app. And then I'll give in the reload option. So the reload option is just going to help reload our server each time we make changes to our code. So I'm just going to come and say reload. And this is going to run our API on localhost 8000. So when I control click on this link right here, it's going to open up in our Chrome, and now we see our message of yo. So now let's go ahead and expose our GraphQL service to our web front end. So I'm just going to close some of these tabs. So what I'm going to do is to come right here, and within our code, I'm going to import our schema, which we've created in schema.py right here. And then we're going to actually just execute queries based on this schema. So I'll just uncomment, I'll just actually comment this. After commenting them, then I'm going to import our schema. So I'm just going to come to our server.py right here, and then I'm just going to import our schema. So I'll say from schema, we are going to import our schema. And right after importing our schema, then we're going to go ahead and expose our schema to our API. So to do that, I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say app.add route, and then I'll specify the path or the URL this route is actually going to be on. So we're going to simply keep it simple with GraphQL, and then it's actually going to be at /GraphQL. And then I'm going to specify the route. So we are going to use Starlet for this. So Starlet is also a dependency of FastAPI that adds some utilities onto FastAPI. So to do that, I'm just going to come right here, and from Starlet, I'm going to import the GraphQL app class. So it's actually going to be from Starlet.GraphQL. I'm going to import the GraphQL app class. So the GraphQL app class is going to take in our schema, and it's going to use this schema to allow us to actually add our schema onto FastAPI. So in this case, we're going to have GraphQL app, and then we shall specify the schema. So in this case, I'm going to say that our schema is going to be the schema that we have right here. So when I save this, hoping that our server is still running, our server is reloaded. So when you go back to our localhost 8000, in this case we go to /GraphQL, we now actually see that we have a very nice user interface right here that can help us to experiment and test our GraphQL service. So to do that, I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to first remove this. I'll remove all these comments right here, and right after removing them, let's try to query for our API. So the way we write GraphQL queries is just like we've seen in our example that we did right here. We write the field, and then you specify the various fields that you want to actually query for that particular type. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to write query, and then I'll specify that in this case we want to query for all people. Now we are going to specify the various fields that we need on this. So let's say we want to query for the email. So if you want only query for the email, we shall press play, and this will return all people with their emails. So let's say I wanted to also look for the last names. So when we say last name, we actually see that the last names of those people have been returned. So let's actually also search for the first names. and this is actually going to return the first name. So let's also say we wanted the ages. Now this is also going to go ahead and return all the ages. Now in this case, we're actually returning all people. Now let's say we wanted to actually return one person and their information. So we're going to go back to our schema and define a field that's going to actually return one person. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll just come right to our code right here. And what I'll do is to write a field. So this is actually going to be for person. And in this case, it's going to be a field. So we're going to actually use a field in this case because we're returning for only one person. So this field is going to be of type person type. Now when I save this, then I'm going to write a resolver that's going to help us return data of that one person. So within here, we can actually even specify the various arguments this field is going to take in. For example, arguments may be the ID of that user because we want to query for the ID or the key that that user has. Remember, we use the dictionary right here. So I'm just going to come to our schema and then I'll specify that we're going to have a key. And this key is going to also have a type. So we're going to specify that our key is going to be of type integer. So right after specifying this, then we're actually going to use our resolver to basically return a user with that specific key. So to do that, I'm just going to come right here and I'll say def resolve. Then in this case, I'm going to say resolve our person. So it's going to take in root and then info. And then I'm just going to come right here and specify that we're going to also have the key. So right after doing this, then we're going to return a person with that specific key in our dictionary. So I'm just going to come and say return data and then we're going to specify key. So let's try to actually search for a person. So to do that, I'm just going to come to our front end right here. So when I try to remove this, so I'm going to write a fresh query. So this query is going to be for our person field. And then right here, since we have an argument, the argument is actually going to be the one for our key. So we're going to provide that by specifying that our key. So let's say in this case, our key is going to be 1. We're also going to write the various fields that we want from this particular person. In this case, I'm going to come and say the email. So when I try to send this, we now see that the email of that person with ID of 1 has been returned. So let's say we want to also search for the last name. This is going to actually return the last name of that person with the ID of 1. So let's also say we are going to return the one with first name of. Actually, here we have an error because it's actually a wrong one. So when I try to actually search for the first name, we actually have the various fields. So let's say one search for the age. This is actually going to return the age of that person with ID of 1. So let's actually return that of ID of 2. So that's going to return the info for the ID of 2, for the key of 3, and for the key of 4. So in this video, we've been able to look at how we can implement a simple GraphQL service using Python and Graphene. I hope this video has helped you to understand some of the basics involved using Graphene or GraphQL in general. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please share it with someone who is interested in learning GraphQL. And don't forget to hit the like button to get this video out there. Don't forget to also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so. Thank you for watching, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye.